Manhattan Project. The hidden stories behind the bomb. Behind the creation of the most destructive weapon in human history lies a web of secrets that were deliberately buried, lives that were shattered in silence, and moral decisions so controversial that they were hidden from the history books for decades. While the world celebrated the end of World War II, entire families were being slowly killed by radiation exposure. Brilliant scientists lived tormented by guilt that would follow them to their graves. And the American government concealed shocking truths about human experimentation, espionage, and betrayal that would make your blood run cold. What you learned in school about the Manhattan Project is just the tip of the iceberg. The real story, the one they didn't want you to know, involves innocent people used as guinea pigs, marriages destroyed by paranoia and secrecy, and moral compromises that still haunt us today. This is not just the story of a bomb. This is the story of what happens when humanity plays God, and the terrible price that was paid in the shadows while the world looked the other way. The secret recruitment and the necessary lies. In the spring of 1942, something strange began happening across America. Brilliant scientists, mathematicians, and engineers started disappearing from their universities and laboratories. No explanations. No forwarding addresses. Just gone. Robert Serber, a talented physicist from the University of Illinois, received a cryptic letter asking him to attend a meeting in Chicago. When he arrived, he found himself in a room with several colleagues, all looking equally confused. A military officer entered and told them they were being recruited for a project of utmost national importance. The catch? They couldn't know what the project was until they agreed to join. They couldn't tell their families where they were going, and they would be moving to a location they couldn't know about until they signed their lives away. This was how it began. Scientists were asked to make a choice that would haunt many of them forever. Trust the government blindly, or potentially let their country lose the war. For those who said yes, the nightmare was just beginning. Entire families were uprooted overnight. Wives were told to pack their belongings without asking questions. Children were pulled from schools with no explanation. They boarded trains heading west into the desert, toward a destination that didn't exist on any map. Los Alamos, New Mexico, a remote mesa 7,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by wilderness and isolation. This would be their prison for the next 3 years. Dorothy McKibben ran the Santa Fe office that served as the gateway to Los Alamos. She watched as hundreds of families arrived, confused and frightened. Young wives clutching babies, elderly parents wondering what their children had gotten them into, teenagers angry at being torn from their friends and their lives. All of them were given fake names and identification cards. They ceased to exist as themselves and became ghosts in a government experiment. Life in Los Alamos was surreal. The entire town was surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. Residents couldn't tell their relatives where they lived or what they were doing. When babies were born in Los Alamos, their birth certificates listed their birthplace as Post Office Box 1529, Santa Fe, New Mexico. These children literally had no hometown. The isolation drove people to madness. Charlotte Serber, Robert's wife, later recalled how women would break down crying in the grocery store, overwhelmed by the loneliness and the constant fear of saying the wrong thing. Marriages crumbled under pressure. Husbands worked 16-hour days on a project they couldn't discuss. Wives stayed home in cheaply built apartments, raising children in a town that wasn't supposed to exist, surrounded by people they couldn't fully trust. Richard Feynman, one of the youngest scientists recruited, watched his wife Arlene slowly die of tuberculosis in a hospital in Albuquerque, 60 miles away. The military rarely granted him permission to visit her. When she finally passed away in June 1945, Feynman was working on final calculations for the bomb. He didn't attend her funeral until days later. The project came first. Always. But nothing compared to the psychological torture of the secrecy itself. Scientists worked on individual components without understanding what they were building. Machinists crafted pieces of equipment without knowing their purpose. Even many of the researchers didn't fully comprehend what they were creating until the very end. The compartmentalization was so extreme that when one scientist, Louis Slotin, asked what would happen if certain materials came together, he was told to stop asking questions. That curiosity would later cost him his life in one of the most horrifying accidents in the project's history. But that story comes later. For now, imagine being locked away in the desert, cut off from the world, working on something you're told will end the war and save millions of lives, but you can't know what it is. Imagine the paranoia that builds when you can't trust your neighbors because any one of them could be an informant. Imagine trying to maintain your sanity when your entire existence has become a classified secret. This was a daily reality for thousands of people trapped in the invisible city of Los Alamos. And for many of them, the secrets they kept would destroy them from the inside out. Robert Oppenheimer, the man divided. If Los Alamos was a prison, then Robert Oppenheimer was its warden, its most famous inmate, and its greatest contradiction all at once. Chosen to lead the scientific effort of the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer was a brilliant theoretical physicist with a reputation for being equally brilliant and troubled. But what the government knew, and what they chose to overlook, was that Oppenheimer's personal life was a tangled mess of questionable loyalties, destructive relationships, and secrets that would eventually destroy him. Robert Oppenheimer was born into wealth in New York City, the son of a successful textile importer. He was a prodigy who read Plato and Greek by age 6 and graduated from Harvard in 3 years. But behind the genius was a deeply troubled man prone to depression, arrogance, and self-destructive behavior. In his 20s, while studying at Cambridge, Oppenheimer fell into a severe depression and reportedly left a poisoned apple on the desk of his tutor, Patrick Blackett, after a confrontation. The incident was covered up, but it revealed a darkness in Oppenheimer that would surface repeatedly throughout his life. His romantic life was even more complicated. In 1936, while teaching at Berkeley, Oppenheimer became involved with Jean Tatlock, a graduate student in psychiatry and a member of the Communist Party. Jean was beautiful, brilliant, and deeply unstable. She suffered from severe depression and had attempted suicide multiple times. Their relationship was passionate and toxic, filled with intense intellectual connection and devastating emotional turbulence. Even after Oppenheimer married Catherine Puning, known as Kitty, in 1940, he continued his affair with Jean Tatlock. Kitty herself was no stranger to controversy. She had been married 3 times before Oppenheimer, including to a Communist Party organizer who was killed fighting in the Spanish Civil War. She was a heavy drinker with a volatile temper, and their marriage was marked by constant conflict. But it was Jean Tatlock who represented the greatest threat to Oppenheimer's position leading the Manhattan Project. Her communist connections made Oppenheimer a security risk. The FBI placed him under constant surveillance. His phones were tapped. His movements were tracked. Every letter, every conversation, every relationship was scrutinized. In June 1943, while Oppenheimer was already deeply involved in the Manhattan Project, he traveled to San Francisco and spent the night at Jean Tatlock's apartment. FBI agents followed him. They recorded his arrival. They photographed the building. The government knew that their chief scientist was romantically involved with a Communist Party member while working on the nation's most classified military project. 6 months later, in January 1944, Jean Tatlock was found dead in her bathtub. The official ruling was suicide by barbiturate overdose and drowning, but the circumstances were suspicious. Jean was found with her head submerged in a bathtub that was too shallow for an accidental drowning. The bathroom door was locked from the inside, but Jean's father had to break it down. Some investigators believed the scene had been staged. Was Jean Tatlock murdered by government agents who saw her as a security threat? Or did she take her own life? Another victim of the depression that had haunted her for years? Oppenheimer never spoke publicly about her death, but those who knew him said he was devastated. He carried the guilt of that relationship, and perhaps the suspicion of what really happened to her, for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, his work at Los Alamos continued at a furious pace. Oppenheimer drove his scientists relentlessly. He was charismatic and inspiring, but also manipulative and demanding. He smoked constantly, barely ate, and grew thinner and more haggard as the project progressed. His marriage to Kitty deteriorated. She drank heavily and had affairs. Their children were neglected, raised largely by housekeepers while their parents were consumed by the bomb and their own demons. But the greatest secret eating away at Oppenheimer was the knowledge of what they were building. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the terrible power they were unleashing. He had studied ancient Hindu texts and became fascinated with the Bhagavad Gita, the sacred Hindu scripture. It was from this text that he would later quote the line that would define his legacy: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." As the project neared completion, Oppenheimer's internal conflict intensified. He pushed forward because he believed the bomb was necessary to end the war and prevent a Nazi victory. But he also understood that they were crossing a threshold that humanity could never uncross. They were creating a weapon that could end civilization itself. And hanging over everything was a constant surveillance. The FBI reports documenting his every move, his past communist associations, his affair with Jean Tatlock, his wife's radical history. Oppenheimer knew that even as he worked to save America, his own government suspected him of being a traitor. So here's what we want to know from you. After learning about Oppenheimer's complicated life, his affairs, his communist connections, and the suspicious death of Jean Tatlock, do you think the government was right to trust him with the Manhattan Project? Or should a security clearance have been revoked from the start? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The secret experiments on humans. We want to take a moment to thank you for staying with us this far. What you learned already is shocking, but we promise you the best was yet to come, and we meant it. Because what we're about to reveal next is perhaps the darkest chapter of the Manhattan Project, one that the government kept hidden for 50 years. This is a story of what happened when scientists decided that some lives were worth less than others, and that the pursuit of knowledge justified any crime. While the world focused on the race to build the atomic bomb, another project was running in parallel, hidden even deeper in the classified shadows. Scientists needed to understand how radiation affected the human body. They needed data on plutonium absorption, uranium toxicity, and the long-term effects of radioactive exposure. And they needed it fast. So they decided to use human beings as test subjects, without their knowledge, without their consent, and in many cases, without any hope of survival. In 1945, at the University of Rochester, New York, a team of doctors injected plutonium directly into the bloodstream of hospital patients. These weren't volunteers. They were people who had come to the hospital for treatment of other conditions. Some had terminal illnesses. Some were simply poor and vulnerable. They trusted their doctors, and their doctors poisoned them. Albert Stevens was one of these victims. He came to the hospital with what doctors suspected was stomach cancer. Instead of treating him, they injected him with plutonium chloride, a radioactive isotope so dangerous that it's measured in billionths of a gram. They gave him a dose that was 41 times the average lifetime exposure to plutonium. Then they sent him home and waited to see what would happen. Albert Stevens didn't die from cancer. He didn't even have cancer. The initial diagnosis was wrong. But he lived for 20 more years with plutonium burning through his body, his bones becoming radioactive, his organs slowly deteriorating from the inside. The doctors tracked him throughout his life, taking regular samples of his blood, urine, and tissue. They treated him like a laboratory specimen, and they never told him what they had done. But Albert Stevens was just one victim in a much larger program. At the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, a residential institution for boys with developmental disabilities, researchers convinced parents to enroll their children in a special science club. The boys were told they would get extra privileges, special meals, and trips. What they actually received was breakfast cereal laced with radioactive iron and calcium. These were children, vulnerable children whose parents had entrusted them to the care of the state. And scientists fed them radioactive oatmeal to study how their bodies process the contamination. The experiments continued for years. The children were never told. Their parents were never told. And when some of these boys developed cancer and other illnesses later in life, the connection to their radioactive breakfast was buried in classified files. At Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, doctors told pregnant women they were being given vitamin supplements to ensure the health of their babies. Instead, they were given radioactive iron. The babies were born with the radiation already in their bodies. Researchers followed these children for years, documenting the effects, watching for cancer and birth defects, treating human lives as nothing more than data points in a classified research paper. Workers at the Manhattan Project facilities were also used as unwitting test subjects. At Los Alamos, at Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and at Hanford in Washington state, workers were deliberately exposed to radiation to test protective equipment and safety protocols. Many were told the work was safe. They were given inadequate protection. And when they started getting sick, when their hair fell out and their skin blistered and their bodies started breaking down, they were told it was unrelated to their work. The Atomic Energy Commission, the government agency that oversaw these programs, kept detailed records of everything. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew they were violating medical ethics. They knew they were breaking the Nuremberg Code, the international standard for human experimentation that had been established after the Nazi war crimes trials. But they didn't care. They told themselves it was necessary for national security. They told themselves that some sacrifices had to be made, and they buried the evidence. It wasn't until 1993, nearly 50 years later, that investigative journalists began uncovering the truth. The Albuquerque Tribune published a series of articles exposing plutonium injection experiments. President Bill Clinton was forced to create the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments to investigate the full scope of the program. What they found was horrifying. Over the course of 3 decades, thousands of people had been used as human test subjects in radiation experiments. Many were vulnerable populations. Prisoners, mentally disabled children, pregnant women, terminally ill patients, and poor minorities who had no advocate and no voice. The experiments had no therapeutic benefit for the subjects. They were purely for research purposes. And almost none of the victims were ever told what had been done to them. The government eventually apologized. Financial settlements were offered to some survivors and their families. But many victims had already died. Many families never knew what had killed their loved ones. And the full truth of what happened in those secret laboratories may never be completely revealed. This is what happens when scientists lose their moral compass. This is what happens when the government decides that some lives are expendable in the name of progress. And this is a legacy of the Manhattan Project that nobody wants to talk about. Not the triumph of science over fascism, but the triumph of cruelty over conscience. The legacy of guilt and the forgotten victims. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, the first atomic bomb exploded in the New Mexico desert. The test, codenamed Trinity, was a success. The blast was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. The light was visible 200 miles away. A mushroom cloud rose 7 miles into the sky. Robert Oppenheimer, watching from a bunker 6 miles away, later recalled that a line from the Bhagavad Gita flashed through his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, turned Oppenheimer and said simply, "Now we are all sons of bitches." They knew what they had done. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the guilt of that moment would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 3 weeks later, on August 6th, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. 3 days after that, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The official death toll was over 200,000 people, most of them civilians. Many died instantly, vaporized by the heat of the blast. Others died slowly from radiation poisoning, their bodies breaking down over days, weeks, and months. The American government censored images and stories from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The public wasn't allowed to see photographs of the burned bodies, the children with their skin melting off, the survivors wandering through the ruins begging for water. The narrative was simple. The bombs ended the war and saved lives. The reality was far more complicated. Years later, many of the scientists who built the bomb spoke about their regret. Oppenheimer became an advocate for international control of atomic weapons and opposed the development of the even more powerful hydrogen bomb. He was punished for this stance with the loss of his security clearance and his reputation. Leo Szilard, one of the physicists who had originally convinced Einstein to write to President Roosevelt warning about the possibility of a Nazi atomic bomb, spent the rest of his life campaigning for nuclear disarmament. He believed the bomb should never have been used on civilian targets. But the guilt of the bomb makers was nothing compared to the suffering of his victims. And we're not just talking about the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. though their stories deserve to be told and remembered. We're talking about the hidden victims, the people who were never supposed to exist, whose suffering was classified and buried. The workers at Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation during the war. They were told the work was safe. They trusted their government, and decades later, they started dying. Cancer, leukemia, birth defects in their children. The government denied any connection to their work. Claims for compensation were rejected, and many died without ever receiving acknowledgement of what had been done to them. The Navajo Nation and other Native American tribes living near uranium mining sites and nuclear testing grounds suffered terribly. Their land was contaminated. Their water was poisoned. Rates of cancer and other radiation-related illnesses skyrocketed. And for decades, the government refused to take responsibility or provide assistance. The downwinders, people living near the Nevada test site, where the United States conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests between 1945 and 1992, were exposed to radioactive fallout that drifted across the Southwest. Children played in contaminated dust. Families drank contaminated milk from cows grazing on contaminated grass. The government assured them they were safe. They weren't. And then there were the atomic veterans, soldiers who were ordered to march through Ground Zero immediately after nuclear tests to assess the effects of radiation on troops. They were given no protective equipment. They were told the radiation was harmless. And when they started getting sick, when their bodies broke down and they developed cancer, the government denied that their service was a cause. It took decades of lawsuits, activism, and investigative journalism to force the government to acknowledge what it had done. Compensation programs were eventually created, but many victims had already died. Many were never compensated at all because they couldn't prove a direct link between their illness and radiation exposure, even though the statistical evidence was overwhelming. The moral question at the heart of the Manhattan Project has never been resolved. Was it necessary? Did the atomic bombs actually save lives by ending the war quickly, or were they unnecessary acts of terror against civilian populations? Could the United States have demonstrated the bomb's power without using it on cities? Should the scientists have refused to build it? These questions have been debated for 80 years and will likely be debated for centuries to come. But what cannot be debated is the human cost. The lives destroyed, the secrets kept, the lies told, the victims who were forgotten and ignored. Oppenheimer died in 1967 from throat cancer, most likely caused by his decades of chain smoking. But many believe he was a broken man long before his death, haunted by what he had created. In 1963, President Lyndon Johnson awarded him the Enrico Fermi Award in an attempt to rehabilitate his reputation. It was too little, too late. The Manhattan Project changed the world. It ushered in the nuclear age, the Cold War, and the permanent threat of human extinction. It proved that science could accomplish the impossible when given unlimited resources and a clear goal. But it also proved that science without ethics is dangerous, that secrecy breeds abuse, and that the ends do not always justify the means. So now we want to hear from you. After learning these hidden stories, knowing what you know about the human experiments, the espionage, the betrayals, and forgotten victims, do you believe the Manhattan Project was justified? Was it a necessary evil that saved more lives than it destroyed? Or was it a moral catastrophe that should never have happened? This is not a simple question, and there are no easy answers. But it's a question we must continue to ask, because the decisions made in the secret laboratories of Los Alamos still shape our world today. Every nuclear weapon that exists, every threat of atomic war, every debate about the ethics of scientific research, it all traces back to those desperate years when brilliant minds built a destroyer of worlds. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video revealing, if you learned something that you didn't know before, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the hidden truths of history. We're committed to bringing you the stories that don't make it into the textbooks, the uncomfortable truths that need to be told. And before you go, make sure to watch the next recommended video where we'll reveal another chapter of secret history that will change the way you see the past. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. And thank you for caring about the truth.